Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Please welcome your moderator, Hodinkee Editor-in-Chief Jack Forster, and panelists Max Büsser, Bart Grönefeld, Tim Grönefeld, and Roger Smith.
Wow. Well, welcome everybody. I would like to thank you all for joining us today. Independent horology is a subject very close to many of our hearts, I know. There's a degree of personal engagement I think that a lot of us feel with independent watchmakers, with their personalities, with their aspirations, their struggles and triumphs, that it's a little bit harder to get from anywhere else, actually. So I really want to thank you gentlemen for joining us today. Tim and Bart Grönefeld, Max Büsser, and Mr. Roger Smith, who was delighted to find out that there was a Roger Smith Hotel in Manhattan. So that was a fantastic discovery. Oh, and also I think we must congratulate you on your OBE, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So well done. Well done. As someone mentioned to me earlier, this is probably a little bit of a step down from meeting the Queen, but we'll see what we can do.
Yes.
Keep things interesting. Gosh, so I think to start out, I think one of the things that I know there are a lot of you out there with an extremely granular knowledge of the work that these gentlemen do, but I think it would be fantastic to hear from you all. Sort of how did you make the transition to becoming an independent watchmaker, to becoming an independent brand? Was it, was it sort of your first choice out of the box? Or was there a period where you transitioned from doing work for someone else to essentially doing your own stuff?
Yes.
Well, that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
Our story started, we are from a jeweler family in the Netherlands, and we moved to Switzerland to become trained as watchmakers. And during our study at WOSTEP at Neuchâtel, our teacher, he was a collector of fine pocket watches. And when I saw those pocket watches the first time, I became aware about high-end watchmaking. Before I only knew ETA and Seiko, good stuff, but not really high-end, especially the finishing. But once I saw the special finishing in those watches, I thought, I really want to become a watchmaker in the field of high-quality timepieces. I found a job at Renault Papi in Audemars Piguet in Le Locle, and I had a dream job because I was able to create nice watches, be responsible for quite a large team. The job was beautiful, but I wanted to go back together with my brother. We wanted to go back to the Netherlands to be back reunited with our families. Once back in the Netherlands, there is no culture of high-end watchmaking, so we went down in terms of quality. It made us a living, but it was not really our passion. And then we thought, okay, how can we get back into the high-end watchmaking? It's by creating our own brands and to show the world what we can do and to be recognized for the work we do. Yes.
Yeah. So it really, the decision to become an independent brand arose out of a desire to do things that you would not be able to do under other circumstances, to create watches according to your own vision, and with qualities and attributes that couldn't find anywhere else on the market.
Yeah, I mean, I worked on minute repeaters, tourbillons, really interesting stuff at Renault Papi.
Kind of spoils you, doesn't it?
It does, because I was only like 21 when I started on a minute repeater. So I was like, and before that, that was before it was like in 1991, and before that, watchmakers in Swiss companies, they were supposed to work like until they are 50 years old. They have enough experience, and then they can move up to do minute repeaters.
Right.
But Renault Papi, as a young company, they only had complicated stuff.
Right.
So there was no chance of starting at the bottom straight away.
Yeah, so just for context, for those of you who aren't familiar with the company, Renault Papi is a complications specialist up in the Vallée de Joux, and they've
but very close.
Very close. And they have functioned as a, I mean, not functioned, but quite a few extremely well-known names in modern watchmaking have worked there at one point or another.
Yeah. Great.
And Max, how about you?
Well, I was very lucky to work for 7 years for Jaeger LeCoultre. I don't think your mic is... Okay, is that better? Yeah.
Oh,
so I'll talk to you guys. I was very lucky to work 7 years at Jaeger and 7 years at Harry Winston. I actually, when I think of it, I owe everything to a gentleman called Mr. Henri John Belmont, who hired me 27 years ago at Jaeger when I was going to work for a big sort of corporation like Procter & Gamble. And I was very lucky that when I entered both companies, they were virtually bankrupt, which on hindsight seems weird.
Nowhere to go but up.
Because exactly, with these incredible people, I learned how to build a company. And at some point in my life, and I've told the story quite a lot of things happened when I was around 33, 35. I was heading Harry Winston, was very successful. And my dad passed away. I went into therapy, and that went boom. And I realized that I needed to create what I believed in. And it made no economical sense, so it was clearly not going to be working for somebody. And
well, you guys basically all became independent watchmakers primarily out of financial motivation.
Clearly. Absolutely. Yeah, and so there, at some point I started dreaming of my dream little company, which was going to create crazy art based on beautiful making, and one day you do the jump. It's a long story, but I'll give some time to Roger.
Yeah. Roger?
Over to me. Yes, I mean, my sort of, entry into watchmaking began as a 17-year-old when I was at a college studying in the north of England, in Manchester, and we had this visiting speaker the next day arriving, a man called George Daniels, who I'd never heard of, and somebody told me that he made watches by hand, and of course I didn't believe that it's possible to make watches by hand, because surrounding me at this college were mass-produced watches. I only ever believed that wristwatches and pocket watches could be made in mass production. And it was the next day when George Daniels arrived, and this very impressive character. And I asked what was on the end of his pocket watch chain, and out came the Space Traveller pocket watch. And that for me was the moment.
Small piece.
Yeah, yes. And that was it. That was the moment, and that was my, sort of realization that I wanted to get into making as opposed to repairing, and never looked back. Yeah.
So when there was never really a period for you where you were professionally involved over the long term in working with mass-produced watches. There was a sort of a decision very early on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was sort of born out of naivety, really. But I mean, you've got to. I mean, Britain. How many years ago now was it? 30 odd years ago. There was no watchmaking at all going on in Britain. There was George Daniels, and that was it.
Right.
And there's no industry. There's nobody I could go and talk to. There weren't these guys. There weren't companies down the road who could make cases, dials, and hands. And so, you had a very, very well, I could only create what I could create. That was my future. And I just knew I wanted to make watches. I didn't know how to get there other than to sit down and try and make a watch. And that was a start.
So, I mean, you were in the interesting position of, you know, kind of having to reinvent the wheel on every level because, you know, as Roger said, there was never really any industrialized watchmaking in the UK at all. The good English watch was always a handmade watch. It was a product, you know, made for gentlemen who were not particularly concerned with what was going on the inside. So there was no really industrial foundation for what you were doing.
No, not at all.
Max, for you, you were in a slightly different position in being located geographically, where there was a possibility to draw on a larger industrial base, but there were, if I remember some of our conversations over the years, there were some complexities involved in working on such a small scale with companies whose level of interest in you is directly proportional to how big the order is.
It's clear that I think when I started out 27 years ago in watchmaking, except for very few companies like Jaeger LeCoultre and maybe Rolex, everybody was subcontracting to all these little artisans. And there was this incredible ecosystem of competence. And then as the company started growing, they started integrating more and more and industrializing more and more. And there's been a complete, I'm going to use a hard word, of genocide of artisans who've either integrated the big structures or had gone bankrupt. So there are very few artisans out there who can actually do the job. So we sort of, all those who want to do a great job, a hand-finished job, an incredibly complex job, we all finish at the same people. And it's a struggle because when we come with a project, they usually go, excuse my English, what the fuck is that? and so that was the beginning. And they were like, what? And so with the years, it's interesting because now over the years we've been working often with the same people for like over a decade. Now they're going, now, what do you have for me? But it's been a difficulty in changing the mindset. And also, of course, we craft less than 20 pieces a month. Right. Which is humongous compared to Roger, of course, but compared to any artisan we go and see, if he's got an order from one of the big brands, we're non-existent. And our quality levels are requested are enormous. So one of the reasons they work with us is not only the challenge, but it's also we give them a communication platform. Yeah. Because by actually crediting them for their work, when most people go, I do everything myself, it's allowing them to make their knowledge, their talent known. Yeah. So, and for you gentlemen, I mean, the work that you've done over the years, you know, since Bruno and Papi gave you some experience very early on in working with extremely complicated pieces, and the remontoire, for instance, that you produce, I mean, that's an extremely unusual complication. Very few people will involve themselves in trying to make one, and it's really kind of a connoisseur's complication. There's a certain amount of prior knowledge that you have to have about problems in watchmaking in order to appreciate the historical significance of the remontoire.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the remontoire is a very complex mechanism. That mechanism actually we have seen in the church movements, in turret clocks.
In turret clocks, yeah.
So we miniaturized it, but we had to solve different problems because there's a chain and it works more with gravity, and this has to work in all kinds of positions. Right. And of course, this is a very complex system. It needs very complex parts, and for those complex parts, we also have to work with other people. Mm-hmm. And in this case, we worked with Andreas Strehler in Switzerland.
Andreas Strehler.
Yeah. And he makes us the parts. He helps us with calculating the mechanisms. And we are actually more like, okay, we have the idea, we have sketches, and with that, we work with other brands, other companies, suppliers, to help us.
Did you sort of say to yourselves at the outset, when you began developing your remontoire, did you say to yourselves, specifically, we want to do something that is going to be, that's going to require something of our potential clients. We want to do something that's going to be intellectually challenging, and that is going to make people think a little bit.
Actually, the remontoire is the watch. It's already a long time in our mind. Actually, it's the first watch what we wanted to create in the beginning. Mm-hmm. Since small kids, we were always in a church clock with my father and grandfather, because they were doing the cleaning of the movement,
right.
maintenance. So almost every week we went up there, and then my father told us always, be careful there because there's the big governor turning around every 30 seconds. So we were really like, whoa, what's going on in that big movement? A lot of noise, a little bit scary. So
Yeah,
the small
yeah.
kids, we had something like, this is really interesting.
Mechanical emotion.
Yeah, mechanical emotions. And finally, after many years, we got lucky and we found the solutions to create this watch.
So, speaking of sort of deliberately setting out to challenge people a little bit. So Max, you know, we've known each other for quite a long time. I remember when you came through New York with HM1, and I'll never forget, we had lunch at the Museum of Modern Art's restaurant, and you showed me the first piece, and I was really, really blown away by it. And I remember thinking that this is a watch that is an opportunity for education in design and also education in watchmaking for the consumer. And you said something very interesting to me over that lunch. You said you said that you felt one of the biggest problems that we have is that in general, people don't understand the context in which design decisions are made and mechanical decisions are made in watchmaking. And the watches that you've produced over the years, so we don't know our own history, basically. People have short memories. And the watches that you've made over the years are challenging, they're challenging to understand mechanically often, and they are certainly not like anything else anyone is doing at all. And it takes a sense of humor, I think, to appreciate them a lot of the time, which is not a common thing in luxury. Luxury is generally, you know, completely humorless. And they require a sense of fun and a sense of playfulness. You know, often in a piece that you know, presents itself in a lot of different ways. So when you started out, did you say to yourself, "I'm going to break a few window panes"?
I have no idea what I was thinking when I was starting. I needed to do it. You don't know, it's some sort of an urge. It's interesting because that first HM1, I put so much energy and so much doubt and so much everything. It was the first time I was creating for myself. I was not educated like that. I was educated to create for the market. And then suddenly, this is me. I mean, I remember the font on it, with Eric Giroux, the designer and greatest friend I've been working with 15 years. I drove him nuts because we went through 300 fonts because it was going to be
300?
Yeah, it was going to be my font. And I was like, no, I couldn't explain why. And then one day, I said, oh.
I'm surprised he's still
cool.
speaking to you.
Yeah, we've had our ups and downs. And he said, that's it. And I said, what's the name? And he said, Star Trek. I was like, that has to be it. But imagine for every single item, I mean, from the crown, how is the crown going to look? How is the shoulders going to look? How is everything? And I think part of me was terrified at what I was doing.
Yeah.
Because I was going, this is like total economical suicide. And part of me was super proud because I was finally doing what I was believing in. Right. And I think that's what's dictated the last 13 years. It's part terror, part pride. And at the end of the day, if there is no terror, I think you actually don't have the pride.
Yeah.
You need to take risks. You need to have the I'm never going to buy this. And, but at the same time, knowing that the way you made it, the people you've worked with, the finishing is extraordinary, and you are proud because the last day of your life, when you look back, you'll go, you did well. That's all that counts.
So,
Yes.
Is that the right answer?
no, that was... watches can be challenging in different ways to different people. So I think about Roger's work, you know, for instance, and your work with the coaxial escapement and your refinements of Dr. Daniel's original design, which you have admirably and obsessively worked to improve on. And some people would have said, you know, his original design, you can't improve on it. You're trying to improve the unimprovable. And you've sort of made constant research into this. This is probably the single most arcane aspect of watchmaking. I mean, there are very few people, even among watch enthusiasts, you know, that you can sit down with and, you know, have an intelligible conversation about escapement geometry with. And I like to think I'm one of them, but maybe not. and you've built so much of the value proposition of your watches around this reduction of watchmaking to its most essential details, and then an attempt to continue to refine those details. So how does that kind of play out for you in terms of communicating with people who love your watches and maybe come to them at first because of the aesthetics and the sort of aura of hand craftsmanship?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all comes down to my, if you like, my training, you know, working with George Daniels. And he was very much, he always used to say to me that, you know, you have to make a difference. You know, watchmaking is there to be improved on. And the mechanical, I mean, it sounds odd, you know, we all have super accurate timekeeping. And yet I'm sitting there day in, day out, obsessing about a tiny little machine that tells the time and how to improve on that.
Right.
And that's what really interests me. And it is this sort of constant refinement of the mechanical wristwatch, the mechanism, and always searching out improvements. And, you know, there's never an idea that, you know, oh, I hope you know, this is what the clients would want. I just hope that they can come and join me on this journey and they enjoy what I'm trying to achieve in watchmaking. And, yeah, it's just this, I can't get it out of my head really. And, you know, George had this idea, you know, he wanted to improve the mechanical timekeeper. He believed that the Swiss lever escapement was mechanically inefficient, and he could create something which, you know, would make the, you know, mechanical watch relevant again.
Yeah, yeah.
When he started to work on escapements, the big thing in those days was the quartz watch in the 1960s and 70s, and as George said, these damned electricians were ruining and threatening his career, and he didn't want, you know, he had to stop that. So that's how he became involved in the, you know, advancement of the mechanical timekeeper, and it's just something that I've become obsessed with, and, you know, we're still doing today, and with amazing results.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, we're now seeing some of our watches which, you know, we're now saying 10 years between services, and that's a very comfortable claim. I think
10 years between services.
Yeah.
And you attribute that to
the coaxial escapement.
coaxial escapement, yeah.
And I think that's a very comfortable claim, and with a new Mark II version where I scaled down the escapement, and, you know, it's just increased the efficiency of the mechanical movement to a completely new, you know, area, and it's very exciting.
It's interesting, you know, this with the internet now, with our capacity to communicate with you know, clients and watch enthusiasts in a way that we couldn't before. You put information like that out there, and it creates a certain set of expectations. You know, like every client for a Roger Smith watch now is going to expect a minimum 10-year service interval, which you're comfortable with.
Yeah, very comfortable. Yes, I mean, I had a client visit us 9 months ago, and he brought a Series 2, which he bought 11, 12 years ago, and it still has a plus gain rate of 3 seconds per day, and it's never been serviced. That's pretty good.
It's not bad at all.
So it's yeah, it's based on experience.
Yeah.
That's what it's all based on.
So, you know, as you establish your companies and as your work gets out there in the world, it creates certain hopes, I think, certain expectations from your clients about what you'll do next. And how do you sort of manage that? I mean, you have a vision for what you want to do, but you also start to build a base of enthusiasts who feed back to you. They say things like, oh, I'd like you to do, you know, maybe you could do this with the design of the case, or maybe you could do this with the design of the hands. Oh, why don't you try creating, you know, this and such a complication? So how do you kind of, and this is something I kind of want to throw out to all of you, and I've had, you know, conversations individually with all of you about this problem. How do you kind of maintain, or do you feel the need to maintain, the purity of your original vision while at the same time managing client expectations and helping them and letting your clients feel that they're heard?
Yeah, that's a difficult point. It's sometimes customers come with ideas, and we rather sometimes not want to hear those ideas. Of course.
Do go on.
No, we are always observing the market around us. We always observe what's going on, but we have a certain we have like 20 models in the future already in our heads, and we would like to follow those
Lines.
our own steps, our own lines. And no, but when customers come with ideas, we do already quite a lot of bespoke dials, for example. But when things go too far, they want a different style of case, I think they better go and find another watchmaker to find their own case. So that's it's a difficult point, but we are always open for suggestions. But,
Right. But you feel at the end of the day, you feel you really kind of have to stick to your guns in terms of certain basics.
Sure. Yeah. We have to be consistent.
Yeah. Which is something I think for your company and for your work, I think consistency is something people expect as much as innovation, and balancing those two aspects of your work is tough.
Yeah, what people are expecting, that's quite a difficult part for me personally, because the expectation is getting higher and higher and higher, and that's sometimes very difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
And every time we launch the new timepiece, it's like, you know, sometimes I feel my life is depending on when I push the button of launch.
Yes, yeah.
The MailChimp going out, and you know, is it suicide or is this a happy life?
Right.
So far, it turned out to be a happy life. So
Yeah.
but it's not easy.
Yeah.
It's our own money, and we have to make a living for ourselves and our workers.
Sure. Yeah, because you're not just making decisions for yourself; you're making decisions for the people who
for
work
many
for you and
people.
with you.
Yeah. It's all micro economy.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that you know, Max, you and I were talking yesterday about this very problem, and you're in the unique position of, well, maybe unique is not putting it quite accurately, but your work involves coming out with often very dramatically different designs from one year to the next. There has to be a sense of continuity of inspiration and continuity of aesthetics to some degree. But for you to, you know, kind of manage client expectations from one horological machine to the next, from one legacy machine to the next, that's got to be a pretty acute, you know, challenge. And launch button and not knowing whether the spaceship is going to you know, go up among the stars or explode on the launch pad. And I would imagine that that's something you can relate to. Well, especially the spaceship metaphor.
It's true that when we started, everybody was like, what the hell is this? And now, 15 calibers later, in 13 years, it's 10 HMs and 5 LMs. Every time we do a launch, I sort of have these thousands of people going, you better wow me.
Right.
You better blow me away. Yeah. And you just can't think of that, because then otherwise you get completely paralyzed. Yeah. You have to fail. It's okay to fail. I mean, we've got 25 people in the company. We've got about 40 artisans who live off us, independents. So we can't just go down. But we need to take risks which will not work. Because otherwise you don't learn. Otherwise you get the God complex. Otherwise you think that you can do whatever you want. But as a creative, I can't think of that. I can't think of, am I going to disappoint? And it hurts. I mean, on social media, which has become, all of us, I think, a part of our platform.
Oh, God.
I can deal with the, oh, it's fugly. I can deal with, like, oh, I could buy my house with that. The usual stuff. It's difficult to deal with the, oh, I'm disappointed. It really is. Yeah. But that's the risk I'm taking, and the most important is that I'm not disappointed with myself. Whenever I come out with a piece, I'm super proud of it. And guys, you'll have to deal with it, because it's my baby. Yeah. But it's tough.
Around a little bit. We've been talking for the last few minutes about you know, some of the struggles that you guys have had in terms of realizing your vision, and some of the challenges in being an independent watchmaker from your side of the bench, so to speak. And I'm sure there must be occasions when you all sort of you know, you look out into the larger horological world and you see what's going on with some of the bigger companies. You know, so we are living in the age of the multinational corporate luxury group. And many of the brands that many of us love very, very much are part of larger companies, publicly traded companies. There are economic pressures to perform in a certain way. And I think some of the disadvantages of potential disadvantages of being an independent watchmaker are fairly obvious. Managing supply chain, managing client expectations, and you know, coming up with something fresh on a reasonably frequent. But I'm curious to hear from you guys what you think some of the problems facing watchmaking as an industry at a larger scale might be. What are some of the problems that the big boys have, or the bigger boys have, or the less small boys have? What are some of the problems they have that you don't, thanks to the size of your production and the fact that you really can guide what you're doing creatively?
I think the biggest challenge big companies have is finding proper watchmakers.
Proper watchmakers.
Proper watchmakers, good watchmakers. Most of them, you know, large companies, they need a few watchmakers. The best ones they need for after sales. For production, they need, you know, normal people that want to do production, because a proper watchmaker, they don't want to do production. So I think that's, the advantage is when you create nice watches, a lot of good watchmakers, they want to work for you. So that's an advantage we have.
Yeah.
And then there's many, I don't know, money for us is always a disadvantage because it's a very small, limited budget what we have to do.
Sure.
But I think the big ones, they also have their financial problems, but they just don't talk about it.
Right.
But yeah, we have to spend it very carefully, and that's what we do.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I've been thinking about this a lot over the last couple of years, and it seems to me that if you're a major luxury brand, if you're a publicly traded company, one of the things that happens is there's a constant pressure to increase prices and a constant pressure to decrease quality, because that's how you improve margin. And when the margin improves, the shareholders are happy, but it can produce without anyone, you know, this is not to say that anyone, you know, working for any of the luxury, you know, group-owned luxury watch brands is, you know, deliberately attempting to defraud consumers, but it's something that can happen accidentally. Right? Prices keep going up, quality keeps going down. There's a lot of pressure to see an improvement in margins, you know, year on year, and before you know it, you're in a situation where there's a kind of race to the bottom, where what you're doing is you're delivering the least possible quality consistent with not destroying the brand image completely at the highest possible price.
For us, that's almost exactly the contrary.
Right.
Because we use stainless steel for our bridges. It's completely economically very stupid material, because it takes a lot more time to machine, a lot more time to finish. But we put we rather work 1 week extra on a watch and sell it than when they start comparing us with the big brands, and they think, oh, this is the same, so why should I buy from independent? We have to be different, and we have to put in, there's no concessions made.
Yeah, quality first.
Sorry?
Always the quality goes first.
Quality goes first, yeah. Well, and you know, for independent watchmaking, it's absolutely essential that quality comes first, because if that starts, you know, quality, however it manifests itself, quality in design, quality in materials, quality in manufacturing, that's what your reputation is built on. That's your you know, USP. And if that's abandoned for the there's no possibility of abandoning objectives of real quality for the sake of marketing image, right? You know, you can't say, well, okay, the quality's declined a little bit, but we have this great movie star who's going to represent Grönefeld watches now.
We don't have those.
Yeah.
We don't make movies in the Netherlands, so.
Well, I mean, there was no watchmaking in the Netherlands until you guys came along, so.
No. Of course, before the Swiss.
Start a movie studio.
Yeah, the watch industry before the Swiss was there were things made in England, Germany, sure. France, Holland as well. Yep. But all died in I don't know, beginning of the 19th century.
Yep. Max, you have been in the position of kind of seeing how the watch industry operates. You know, in your time at Harry Winston, you had an opportunity to, you know, and before, you had an opportunity to work in, somewhat larger companies with some advantages of scale. And you know, certainly in the time that I've known your work as an independent brand, there have been tremendous upheavals in the industry as a whole. What are your views on the sort of the disadvantages of being a larger company relative to being an independent watchmaker?
I suppose the incentives are different. It's clearly when you're into double-digit growth every quarter, that makes your life pretty complicated when you're in an artisanal environment. So you basically get rid of the artisanal environment.
Right.
A big company cannot depend on the unique talent of one or other individuals. So it has to put processes into place so that they don't depend on the quality of the watchmaker.
So this is actually, if we could kind of like just peel that aside as a separate subject for all of you. I mean, this is an absolutely critical point for, you know, for a larger company. You can't have people get too attached to a single person. And yet, if you take the human touch, if you take human personalities out of the equation too much, then you're just dealing with kind of an impersonal product that you don't feel any sense of human connection to.
But if I may, they address a different client base.
Right.
I mean, we can't, actually it's very difficult to compare. They address needs of different clients who are looking for other things, while I don't think any of us address those sort of clients.
Right.
So
what you're saying, Max, is if somebody is saying to themselves, I would love to buy an extremely unusual wristwatch that's mechanically unique and that draws on the aesthetic vocabulary of 1960s and 1970s popular science fiction.
Can you send me that person?
They're not.
I don't know where he is.
So you're saying that person is not looking for, they're not saying to themselves, do I buy an Omega?
No, look, I mean, we're not, I don't think we should make judgments of quality.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's a very risky slope to go down. There is a product for everyone in this world. And some big brands address the needs of certain clients who don't care if there is a Breguet spiral, a curve on the spiral. They don't care if it's Anglais by hand. They don't care if it's hand engraved. Yeah. And I often have these discussions with people who come up to me wearing XYZ and say, like, why is your piece 3 times the price of mine? And I start explaining, and their eyes glaze over, like, oh, get over and just leave. Because they're just not interested.
Yeah.
So you can't speak that language to them, and these big brands do, and so everybody's happy. I don't think we can start pointing fingers, but it doesn't make anything advance.
Right.
We address, I think, the people who are here. And
people who are here.
Exactly. And the big brands often address people who are looking for something very different. Mm-hmm. It's okay.
Yeah. Roger?
Yes, I need to think about this one. Yeah, I mean, well, I think what Max said is perfectly true. You know, we are creating very unique watches that you just can't find anywhere else out there. You know, the brands are, you know, huge marketing machines with different stories, aren't they? And it could almost be said that it's harder for them. You know,
so
because
harder for them.
Yeah, because they've now disconnected themselves from watchmaking, the roots of watchmaking. But you know, here we are all sitting here, and we've got our own very hands-on approach to watchmaking and creating very, very unique individual watches, and that's our advantage. It could be a problem in the future for these larger brands. I don't know, but. You know, there's certainly, you hear this sort of conversation about the millennials and, you know, and wanting to, you know, have a real story.
We have some in my office.
Do you?
If you'd like to meet them.
I'd like to meet one.
I'd be happy to.
And, you know, who want a real, they don't care if, is Aldous in here? They don't care if there's an actor sort of promoting their brand, but, sorry Aldous if you are here, but they don't want that, they want a real story, and so, you know, it's, I don't know, will these large brands have a problem in the future? I'm not sure.
Well, I guess we're going to find out. Speaking of finding things out, We are, I think, ready. I'm sure there are quite a few of you who would like to have an opportunity to ask these gentlemen a little bit more about their work. You have some specific thoughts that you'd like to share with them. So now seems like a great time to sort of open things up to you folks. I know it's, whoa. Ooh. Yes.
So when we talk about the difference between independents and the big guys, let's call it, one of the things that I would be curious to hear from you is, as far as, I guess, brands are concerned, in 50 years, let's call it, when you think about legacy, succession, continuity, how do you think about, like preserving the essence of what you've created into the future? Like, is the intent to actually create a brand for hundreds of years? Is the intent just, for that to conclude at a point in time when you decide, not to continue with watchmaking? Like, very curious to hear how you think about that versus, like now big corporations that are just, existing in perpetuity and don't necessarily have like that common thread of like a founder anymore.
So the question is, in essence, what happens when you guys are dead?
Yeah, a little morbid, but yes.
I mean, it's having a little fun with it, but it's actually a brilliant question. And yeah, I'm sure the question of legacy and continuity is something you guys must think about a lot.
Yeah, we think a lot about that because it's a question people are buying a watch or ordering a watch from us. And for this reason, I think we are quite lucky because we come already from a watchmaking family with a history for more than 100 years. So we are now, we are together the third generation in watchmaking in our family. We are the two brothers who started the brand, but for the future it looks really good because he has two daughters, and I have two sons, and they are also into mechanics, and we need to, that Grönefeld is going for the future as a brand, as an independent brand, yes.
As an independent family brand for the
Yes,
foreseeable future. That's pretty fantastic.
That's what we hope for.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
And it looks like it's going to happen.
It's, I mean, it's easier if you're good at creating a sense of pervasive guilt in your children. So I can't recommend that highly enough as a strategy. Max?
Well, I named my daughter Mila with an M. It's not by chance, but
okay.
she's 5 years old. So she's 5 years old, poor Mila. No pressure. No, it's actually something which actually we discuss internally a lot. What happens if something happens to me in 5 minutes or in 30 years? I've actually structured the company so we've got incredible people in it. And slowly, I've just got one role, which is the creative director. When I started all alone in my flat 13 years ago and doing everything. So try and take a step back, which means that if something happens to me, and I hope nobody thinks that so the prices go up, we have to find an art director, basically. I don't know where, but it'll be less complicated than if I was this omnipower CEO, owner who micromanages everything. I used to micromanage absolutely everything. Now I've really taken a big step back. And if something happens, we'll have to find an art director.
Yeah.
And wait till Mila takes the company over.
Well, and I mean, again, to step back a little bit, the company is called Maximilian Büsser and Friends, MB&F, and it's been framed from the beginning as a collaborative enterprise. And you were always completely transparent about who contributes what, and everyone is kind of presented on equal footing as part of the creative team. And that's, I think, a great guarantor of longevity. I mean, the fact that it has been framed as a collaborative enterprise from the get-go. Roger?
Yes, it's something I think it must be because are we all around the 50s, approaching the 50s, and you're sort of thinking of the future. But yes, we have a couple of young girls, but if they're going to get into watchmaking, who knows? But it's a serious concern, and so much so that we've started implementing procedures throughout the whole company and basically future-proofing it. So if I do fall off the perch tomorrow, the business will continue, and it's been we've started the process now, and it'll probably take another couple of years to get up to speed on that. But no, it's something I'm determined that this business will continue long after, you know, my passing, and we're all making the right steps for that.
I think also one of the very clear decisions we've taken is that we only use steel and brass. This may seem very weird to you guys, but that means that anything we do today, even if the company had to disappear one day, in 100 years, great mechanic and watchmaker together will be able to do every part.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's one of it. Yeah. I started off on 2 of my pieces. I had some UV Liga pieces. I'm like, oh no, even though it's great, no, I'm not touching that. I'm not saying it's bad, but for the perennity of the product in 100 years, we're just using steel and brass.
Right, right. Wonderful question. Thank you, and thank you, gentlemen. Great answers. Yes.
Hi. So obviously, to look at who this direct audience is in front of you, some of us are independent watch lovers and collectors, but I think it's probably safe to say that the majority in the room are vintage collectors. And I'm interested to hear from each of you how you think that independent watches could appeal to a vintage collector. This has been obviously a huge boom in vintage in the last 10 years. And I'm sure some people like vintage for reasons that will never cross over to modern or independent, but there are probably some crossover points, and I'd love to hear your opinions on what those are and how to spark this interest in those types of people.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I was actually wondering the exact same thing earlier today, so great question. Gentlemen?
Actually, we are inspired by vintage watches, but not really vintage wristwatches, but I was inspired by vintage pocket watches. The big, the mega quality pocket watches that made me go into this. Our watches, I think they reflect very much already vintage timepieces, and we like to think of that we create vintage pieces for the future.
Max?
I have no idea. I've never even thought of it. At the end of the day, when you gravitate to creators like us, I think you gravitate towards humanity. And whatever we're creating today is going to be vintage in 20, 50 years. But
It's happening with alarming rapidity.
And so I'm not sure we're actually speaking the same language, but I'm happy to have the discussion.
Roger?
Yeah, I have a few, vintage watches, as we discussed on Hodinky a while ago, and for me it's the story, the story of these sort of watches, and I'm sort of very much movement led. That's what interests me, and that's why I bought the mechanisms, the watches that I bought, and it's a story, and I think we all have a real story, and if there is anything that can attract vintage collectors into our world, it is you can come and touch us. You can, we're real, and
not too close.
And I think that's it for me. It's real.
It's real.
Yeah.
It's real.
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay, super. Thank you. Let's see who else. The gentleman in the back.
Yes, thanks for letting us ask questions. This is really cool. I'm an artist. That's part of what I do, and I'm just curious if any of you have particular inspirations for your designs or your methods that exist outside of the sphere of pure horology.
I'll have to take that one.
Max.
Max.
It's interesting because I have no idea where the inspirations come when I create something, and then I find out once I've finished my sketching or my idea where it comes from. So people sort of think that I'm going, oh, I want to create a plane inspired, or I want to create this piece I designed because I thought it looked so amazing. And then I realized where the inspiration comes from. I think it was Coco Chanel who, at least there's a saying attributed to her. She said, he who insists on his own creativity has no memory. Which basically, the guys who say, I've had this incredible idea that nobody's had, no way. You've had all these inspirations which have been seeping through you over all the years from this to there, right. And then one day you regurgitate a different version of it, at least as far as I'm concerned. So it's my life. It's basically a bit like my psychotherapy, my creativity, at least when you see something like this.
How are we doing for time? We have time for one more? Yeah. Yes.
You. There's something to be said about progress and evolution into watchmaking. You guys are on the forefront of that, but I wanted to ask and know your opinion about that mixture between if a big watch brand comes to you in a form of, let's see how I can draw out inspiration, or we can collaborate. We saw, for example, the example of the Opus line with Harry Winston. What's your take on it? How will you take it? And nowadays, given that this is such an emotional product for you, how will you take that on having your name out, with mixing with some other brands, etc.?
No. It just can't happen, you know. I mean, the watches that I make, you know, are very personal. You know, every client that comes to me, they usually want something different and unique, and I have to like what they are asking me to make. And if my heart is not in that watch, then it really is an awful process. And yes, I mean, nobody has asked, but the answer would definitely be no, just because it dilutes what I'm trying to achieve. And, you know, my pleasure is in making my watches for people. So it's, no, it just couldn't happen.
It's rather like what you gentlemen were saying at the beginning of the conversation. It's essential. If you're going to do this at all, it's essential to be able to articulate your own vision, not somebody else's.
Sure. Yeah.
Max?
It's a good question. In every other size of the world now, you've got these capsules. So a big brand goes to a small creator and creates something, because often the incentive in a big brand is very difficult to create, because nobody wants to be the CEO who took the risk of the thing which didn't sell. So nobody wants to stray from the path. So you go and get a creator who's crazy and, oh, but he's the one who did it, not me. So it's interesting it's not happening in watches. I've never been contacted. I don't know if anybody else has. They go and get people who are artists or celebrities or things like that, but they don't get actual watch creators to work with them. And I don't know why. I think it would be interesting. But you need to have the same values. I mean, I've been doing creative joint ventures for, good grief, practically 2 decades now. It started with Opus. The secret of a great creative joint venture is you need to have the same values. You need to have the same goals. So if one wants to make a ton of money and the other one wants to be proud, it's not going to work. And you need to have a common enthusiasm. So it is, maybe it's not happened because it is complicated to have, we're both on the side of this big river, and I'm not sure it would be that easy to actually work together.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to thank you all again for joining us. I would also like to say what a privilege it is to be able to share this stage with these gentlemen. You folks represent in your respective domains, I think, watchmaking right now. From a design standpoint, from an innovation standpoint, from a craft standpoint. It's wonderful to have you out there. It's been wonderful to have you here, and thank you. Thank you.
We would like to thank Audemars Piguet, BMW, Cartier, Grand Seiko, Oris, and Zenith for their support in making this weekend possible.